Amy Bodkin. I am autistic myself, as well as a former school psychologist, and I work worldwide with families, supporting families that have some kind of need outside the average. I kind of look at it from all three perspectives, from a personal perspective, the perspective of a parent, and the perspective of a professional. So it's a little bit unique. So at any rate, I'm autistic, a former school psychologist, and I have two autistic teenagers that I homeschool. So I've gotten to kind of see it from all three angles, which is a little bit unique. Not everyone gets to see it from all three. I wanted to start out today with a story because I think sometimes stories really help. So this story we have dubbed in our household Hurricane Amy. So there was one day, and I had been particularly overwhelmed. And it wasn't, you can get overwhelmed from life, and it causes more sensory overload because you have less bandwidth to be able to handle the sensory inputs when you also feel overwhelmed in other ways. And so I had a real sensory need at that point for some heavy work. That's what we call it when we have a child who needs to maybe lift things that are heavy, exert some gross motor skills on objects, to feel the weight of something. It can be very sensory calming. So I have completely at this point been so overwhelmed that I really honestly almost really have no earthly idea what I'm doing. Like I'm really kind of operating on instinct for the most part. And I start turning over furniture in our house. So, for a lot of people, that would look like, oh, okay, she's like really angry and throwing a temper tantrum. But in reality, it was that I was so overwhelmed that I was trying to meet those sensory needs that I had for heavy work. That's what we call it in occupational therapy. And it was I felt very overwhelmed. Sometimes when I have a meltdown, I will start shaking my hands a lot, or I will start rocking back and forth a lot. I will also I communicate a lot. I talk a lot, but I will be very limited in how much I am able to get across. I remember one particular meltdown of my daughter's. This was really when I realized that she needed some support. It really came home to me because she was little at the time, but she had been potty trained.
Okay.
And in that moment, she lost the ability to hold her bladder. And I realized at that point, oh my goodness, you've been potty trained for a long time now. And obviously you need help. Like this isn't something that you can manage on your own. You are overwhelmed. This isn't something within your control. Because if she had been able to control it, she would have. And so a lot of times we see this lack of control for certain types of things, but also we see an overwhelm where we see more activity. And so when we had Hurricane Amy, as we lovingly like to call it, I'm in our main room in our house and I am upending furniture and very overwhelmed. And I get a text from my daughter saying, I know that you're overwhelmed and I can help you, but I can't help you until you're quieter, because she would get overwhelmed by noises. And I didn't see it until afterwards because I was so upset. A lot of times when you are so overwhelmed like that, there's a limit to how much comes in. And you're also limited in what comes out. So at any rate, after the meltdown wore itself out, because meltdowns, they run through a cycle. Okay. It's like a bell curve. You start down here, everything's fine. There are triggers, they start to build. This is not the point of no return yet. But then we get up to a point where we're up here and there's been enough triggers, we haven't been able to adjust, and we haven't been able to compensate or avoid, and it reaches the point of no return. And at this point in time, you are in it for the long haul. So when you get to that point, there is no like going backwards. You need to just buckle up because you're in it for the roller coaster. And then you reach the peak where things are at its worst, and then things start to get a little bit calmer, a little bit easier. And then there's a point where we call it that point of de-escalation, where it's kind of like it's run itself out of gas. And at that point, honestly, most of the time you're exhausted. And you're really not in a place to be addressing any problems that came up during the meltdown. So, if you caused some damage to something during that meltdown, that is not the time to address it. That's the time where most of the time people need rest or sleep because it's exhausting, because your entire body is going into fight or flight, basically. And it's looking for whatever sensory inputs are going to support you through that process. And that's an extremely exhausting process because basically your entire body's on red alert. So anyways, after Hurricane Amy, my entire family came back into the main room after I had totally worn myself out, literally. And they were like, okay, Hurricane Amy, yeah, you caused a little bit of damage here. And they were kind of joking with me a little bit in a really teasing way, and I knew they were. And then they all helped me pick up all of the furniture that I had upended. And my daughter went and got some tea, and she made us a cup of tea, and she's like, let's sit down and let me hear what you're so overwhelmed by, because she's like, there's got to be something going on here. And I loved that moment for what it proved about what we had been doing for years in our house. In our house, whenever the kids would have a meltdown, it was not a moment where we would punish them or be disappointed in them. It was an opportunity to support them. And every time my kids had a meltdown, I would go scour the house, bringing all the things to them that I thought might help them regulate. I knew in that moment they could not think clearly enough to go find what they needed, but I could go bring them things. Sometimes, with my daughter especially, it would be playing her favorite music outside her door, or bringing her a blanket or a cup of hot tea, or whatever it was that I thought could be calming for her. All the sensory things. And it wasn't always the same for each person. Some people need quiet. They need to be left alone. So you take all of the supports and you drop them outside the door or right inside the door and you leave. One of my kids especially was one of those that needed to be left alone. She had to work it out herself. My son, on the other hand, you could leave him alone for a few minutes, but he really needed you to come in there and give him a hug. That was something that really worked for him. And each person's a little bit different. Each person's different in the things that can overwhelm and trigger them. They're also different in which sensory pathways are more likely to get overwhelmed. And also which sensory pathways are more sensitive to begin with and more easily overwhelmed because of that. So I have one client where they are particularly overwhelmed by their sense of smell. It's highly sensitive. And so any sense can really throw things off for her. And when she is more stressed, she is able to handle less scent. It can actually cause physiological changes in her body where she gets more tired and doesn't feel as well and has more issues with chronic health conditions. So at any rate, you can see a lot of these different kinds of things happen in a meltdown. And a lot of times a meltdown looks like somebody has completely lost their cool. Because quite honestly, most of the time they're really not thinking with their prefrontal cortex. They're thinking with their what we call, some people call it the lizard brain. It's the emotional part of the brain, which is the more like deeper part in the brain, the limbic system. And you're basically, in a lot of ways, it's more instinctual. I mean, if you think about animals, a lot of their behavior is instinctual. And it doesn't involve as much thought process. A lot of those more higher brain functions happen in the prefrontal cortex. And so when you're working from your limbic system, you're not even going to your prefrontal cortex. So in a lot of ways, we would probably describe what is a meltdown as looking more like a toddler tantrum. But the reason is because toddlers don't have much of a prefrontal cortex. So they're already working from their emotional brain. And so it never really, that's why toddlers often don't make sense when they are upset um, or having a tantrum themselves. So in a lot of ways it can be similar, but it's not a tantrum. It's more of like the brain has shorted out and it's stopped. It's kind of it's not continuing to process at a higher level in the brain. Um, but when my daughter was able to sit down and make me a cup of tea, I realized that my kids had learned basically to do what we had been doing for them their entire lives. And that was how to provide support through those kinds of situations. Because family is where we are supposed to be able to support each other. That should be where you are able to get support that you can get nowhere else, where you can be understood for who you are because you are your most authentic self typically at home. At least I think that's the ideal. And for them to be able to see how to support me through a meltdown, that tells me that they have some great skills that they will be able to use with their own families as they grow, whether that's with a spouse or with other children, to recognize that sometimes we're overwhelmed and we need support and we need understanding and listening and compassion. One of the things that can trigger me very quickly is when I don't feel heard. And a lot of that is because as an autistic person, I've had so much trouble with communication. I speak a lot and I talk a lot, but being able to get your ideas across in a way that other people understand, it doesn't always hit. And it can also sometimes be very difficult to be able to make yourself heard and understood in the way that you mean. And so that one is honestly one that frustrates me very quickly, that will max out a lot of my bandwidth very fast. And so because of that, that tends to be like one of the big triggers. There can be other triggers. It can also just be because I've got too much sensory input or whatever. There can be a lot of different things. So it just depends. But for me, that is one of my big triggers. And so for me, one of the things that's most helpful is when I get into these states is to have someone present who is listening, not demanding any answers, but just present and listening. Because then it makes me feel like, okay, I'm not by myself. Someone hears me and eventually we'll get it figured out. no pressure to actually be able to communicate something, because that usually does not happen well until after you reach the de-escalation point in the process. And that takes some time. But those are some of my triggers personally. If I'm sick, I have a lot less bandwidth, more likely to get there much faster. If I'm tired, haven't slept well, basically it's kind of a bit of a Cinderella type situation, or maybe Goldilocks. Goldilocks is the better way to describe it. Goldilocks and the Three Bears. It can be too hot, it can be too cold. What we're looking for is just right. And you're looking throughout your life, your day, all moments, you're looking for that just right fit. If it gets too hot, then you can have trouble. If it gets too cold, you can have trouble. If it gets too hard, you can have trouble. If it gets too soft, you can have trouble. And so you're kind of trying to maintain that environment that provides you with some consistency, and also provides you with the ability to be able to stay in that comfort zone where your senses aren't getting overloaded, because a lot of autistic people, we get overloaded from our sensory processing pathways. And so you're trying to find that just right spot to be in so that we don't experience meltdowns. The problem is that life is full of surprises, and we don't always cope well with surprises because our sensory pathways are not prepared for surprises. They're also not, honestly, they just don't have as much bandwidth. So maybe you're already sensitive to sound or to noise or to smell or something, and then something else happens, and then all of a sudden you have even less bandwidth than you did before. So it's a bit of a problem. But watching our children support me through a meltdown once they were older, it made me realize just what they had learned from watching us support them through meltdowns when they were younger, because they realized that it is a time where someone is needing help and compassion and to be heard and listened to, and that there are feelings underlying where you're at, whether that's a feeling of just sensory overwhelm, or if there was something that happened before that led to that, or if you just don't feel very good and maybe you're sick. And because you're sick, you end up feeling a little bit more. I think the best way to describe it is that, like, when I get sick, it's kind of like I revert to a little bit of a toddler in a way, honestly. It's not that I am a toddler, it's that I lose a lot of my ability to function and to cope with sensory issues. I get more overwhelmed, and I am much more likely to melt, to be maybe more sad or weepy when I'm not feeling well. I just have less bandwidth. That's really what it comes down to. I have less bandwidth. And when I have less bandwidth, then that means my system gets overloaded very quickly. And when my system gets overloaded very quickly, we end up back in that animal brain, the emotional limbic system of the brain, and we're not really using the prefrontal cortex as much. And really, a lot of times people think that meltdowns are tantrums. They aren't. The reason that they look that way sometimes to people is because a lot of what children do instinctually helps in some ways. Like, children automatically find ways of avoiding the things that are causing them to be stressed. Like, a lot of their instinctual things, they're seeking out play, they seek out sensory experiences. All of those things are things that help when you are completely overwhelmed. And so a lot of what children do during a tantrum is actually functional for dealing with a meltdown. Difference is that a tantrum, you're in control. Usually you're using that prefrontal cortex to potentially you could even be manipulative in a tantrum because you're using that prefrontal cortex. A meltdown is not the same thing. You do have toddlers who have meltdowns, which is probably why there's the confusion that exists, because sometimes a toddler's having a meltdown, sometimes they're having a tantrum. Being able to tell the difference, that's the difficult part. And Ken's right, it causes a lot of problems when it comes to law enforcement, especially because law enforcement can't always tell the difference. They're not trained in that area most of the time. We're very fortunate where I live that we have our law enforcement trained on this specifically. And they have an entire program dedicated to trying to make sure that we do not end up with more autistic people being killed accidentally because someone thinks that they're high or something else. Because sometimes, I mean, honestly, when you're in a meltdown, sometimes it'd be very easy to misinterpret it as someone being on drugs or having a tantrum or something because we're not fully in control. It's very instinctual, and a lot of the things we're doing are sensory things, like whether that's shaking your hands or rocking back and forth. And a lot of times, some of the things that we do are things that we see in people who are on drugs. So, it's a real problem because a lot of people don't recognize it. It's a real problem in schools as well because a lot of teachers don't recognize it. But the real important thing is to always approach things with compassion and to realize that there are things that you don't understand, that you can't hear yet, and that you need help to be able to understand about that person's experience. And to be able to approach that with a sense of compassion, but also bringing all of the sensory supports that might be helpful. Because the odds of someone in a meltdown being able to go and find the supports they need are very slim. Once we reach that point, we're on overwhelm. So that's a little bit of an example from our own house, and also about some of the ways that can look practically speaking, but each person's totally different.
Thank you, Amy. So you and I have talked about this before. I mean, when you meet one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Basically, everyone is different. So it's hard to talk about meltdowns in a more general term because everybody's going to deal with that situation differently. And and out of respect for the law enforcement, of course, they do have to make 1 second decisions sometimes. And I know,
100%.
yeah, and I know, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit because I know in the one case, I think it was in Seattle, where the individual was having a meltdown, and I think he had some sort of a shovel or something that in his hand, and he was coming at them.
Yeah.
And how would you handle that situation if you were law enforcement?
Law enforcement, it's difficult because, their job is to enforce the law. And you're right, they have to make snap second decisions. And the other problem is that they're usually out with the public. In a classroom situation, you can quickly evacuate all the other students from the classroom. And then that way everyone else is safe and you can let it kind of burn itself out. But when you're out in public, especially depending on what you may or may not have available to you, that could be a problem. Especially like, if people are at risk of being hurt by that shovel and and the people, maybe it's a crowded area where they're not going to be able to isolate and contain this person, then that would make it really difficult. And quite honestly, whatever you say is probably not going to completely process because, like I said, the brain's kind of shorted out a bit. So it's kind of going back into that emotional limbic system. And a lot of what you say isn't going to come through. Um, if you had enough space and people weren't as at risk, then you could try talking calmly and saying, I see you're upset. If you could place the shovel down, like lay it down, we'll listen to what you have to say, or something along those lines. But it's also very possible that that won't work because, especially if you're in an environment with a lot of other people that are in close proximity, and they're most of the time they're not meaning to hurt anybody. They're just so overwhelmed and they're going so much off of emotion that sometimes they're not even totally conscious of what they're doing. So it'd be a
So
difficult situation.
it is, and I would love to have a further discussion with that law enforcement training that they have in your area. So also, from a teacher standpoint, um, I would assume teachers are not trained on this.
Some, it's not common, but there are a few programs where we're seeing more training on behavior and meltdowns and such. So it's rare, but it does occasionally happen.
Okay, because obviously in that situation, the teacher needs to handle it again, like you said, evacuate the room if need be, and get the person to calm down, kind of situation, which is the correct way to do it. But
Safety is
then,
always the top priority because you can't make someone get out of a meltdown. So you have to make the safety of that person and everyone else in the area your priority.
and and then the other part of it too is once that person has uh, gotten over the meltdown, I'm talking about child in a school situation. The other school students in the class are probably at that point concerned. It would be good to have a teacher that could explain to them what's going on.
Yeah. And honestly, I think that that makes the biggest difference for honestly kids in general. Um, a lot of times when you have a kid with a disability, one of the things that makes it even harder is when the adults around them can't explain what they're experiencing to other children that don't have a disability. I remember this was actually a problem when I was growing up because when I was diagnosed, my parents got a pamphlet. There was no internet at the time. They got a pamphlet and that was it. And it's a very limited amount of information. And so they were not able to effectively explain to my siblings why I did things the way that I did. And it really had a negative impact on my relationship with my next sister down because she didn't understand and no one was able to explain it to her. Now we do much better because she has a daughter that's not unlike me and she's able to understand a little bit more why I do things the way we do because our understanding has increased. You can find out more information online. There's more resources. But being able to explain things to other children, being able to verbalize things, being able to help a child who can't verbalize their experiences to someone else to be able to verbalize that for them can make a huge difference in their experience, but also their relationship with those other children. And I think that's really, really helpful when we're able to do that.
And I think you make a good point too that it's important to understand, and maybe you can explain a little bit, but with understand it's not a behavioral choice. It's a neurological response. So understanding the difference in that, you're going to have a different response to it yourself. And
Right. And that also is important to explain in a school setting because kids really like it when things are fair sometimes. And sometimes they like to say that that's not fair. Why'd you treat them that way and not me? And that's where a lot of that communication comes in, of being able to verbalize what their experience is like, how that might be different from this other person's, what's happening neurologically inside their mind in an age appropriate way. Uh, that that is extremely important. And it's also extremely important because children do not have the ability to explain why their experience is different. Like, I didn't have the awareness as a child to explain any of this because I didn't realize it was different from everybody else. Like, I didn't realize that my experiences were not the same as everyone else's because I hadn't experienced what everybody else typically experienced. So being aware of that, understanding that, and then putting that into words, that takes a lot of brain functioning that I hadn't developed yet because I wasn't old enough to have developed those skills. And so adults being able to communicate those things can make a huge difference in how a child experiences a meltdown, how other children experience their meltdown, how safe and secure people feel, um, how supported, all of those things.
okay. So let's take it from two sides. First of all, as a person working with somebody who has autism, is there anything that should be observed that may be indicating that that person is heading towards a meltdown?
Each person's a little different, but usually you will see an increase in agitation. Um, Sometimes you will see an increase in a desire for sensory inputs. Sometimes you will see an increase in repetitive behaviors. Like I said, sometimes when I go into one, I will start shaking my hands or rocking back and forth. Uh, I will also probably have already been somewhat on edge, but like all of these things are fairly subtle things. You have to really be paying attention. Um, and some of us, it's more subtle than others. Some people, it's very subtle and it's very difficult to determine. Um, but mostly what you're looking for is you're looking for a change. Usually a change that looks somewhat agitated and also looks somewhat like they're looking for sensory inputs of a particular kind.
Okay.
Usually that's what you're looking
And I would think that and some people have learned to kind of mask it too, so you don't even see
for.
it
That
coming. So
further
yeah,
complicates things.
yeah. So
Hmm.
my response to somebody who I know is having a meltdown is to am I correct? And what from based on what I learned from what you said is to create a calming environment. I would assume maybe in some cases touching that person is not the right thing to do. Uh,
Depends on the person.
yeah,
That's the
yeah.
hard part.
All right, so we want to now calm the situation down in any way we can, right at this point.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so providing them with as many sensory supports or access to sensory supports as possible is helpful. It's best, honestly, if you know the person better and you know what they are drawn to. But quite honestly, like if it was a kid I don't know, I would probably, like if I was at my house, I would run through my house collecting different things and just like bring them and drop them right there in front of them and hope that one of them was the right thing. Um,
Okay. So
some people don't want to be touched. Some people want
yeah,
distance. And so I
yeah,
try to like provide presence without being in their space.
yep. Okay. So on the other side of things, as a autistic person, do you know it's coming? do you, what,
Sometimes, like
okay. So,
you reach a point where like by the time you've reached the point of no return, you pretty much know. But I don't think you always like it's more of a subconscious knowing. Like I know, but I'm also not totally aware of what I'm doing because my prefrontal cortex is kind of shut off. So
okay.
it's more at an instinctual level. Does that make sense?
Hmm. Okay.
Like,
So, because I'm thinking like maybe like in a work environment, if that happened, that person would be fired probably.
right.
So
And then
if you felt it coming on, maybe you could get yourself to a quiet place to calm down.
that is possible. It is possible sometimes to know something's coming and to be able to sometimes get yourself to a space where you like, and sometimes people can hold like masking, they can hold it in for a short period of time, not long, but a short period of time, just enough to get to a safer place. But that involves a fair amount of masking ability. Like we talk about masking as being bad, but there are pluses to masking because without masking, you end up sharing all of your emotions, whether or not you want to or not, with everybody. And so there are certain strengths of masking. One strength of masking is being able to kind of contain that meltdown for a very short period of time so that you can get to a place that is safe to have that meltdown. Those are definitely strengths of masking. I mean, there's downsides because if you wear a mask all the time, do you even know who you are?
Yeah.
So it's pluses and minuses there. But there is the ability to know that at least at an instinctual level that something is off, that something's coming, that you need a break. Like you're maybe not thinking about it with your prefrontal cortex, but you can feel it. And a lot of times, if you're good at masking, sometimes you can manage to wait until you get to a safe space. And I've actually seen my children do this too as they've gotten older. They can, well, one of them cannot mask at all to save her life. But
Yeah.
and this is why I say that masking is an advantageous skill because if she's upset about something, she shares it with everyone, whether she wants to or not, because she can't
Uh,
hold it back. But my other
yeah.
one, he will hold it in until he gets to a safe spot. And then all hell breaks loose and we all get to experience the intensity of what he has been trying to hold back because it's gotten
Hmm.
even more intense in the process.
Hmm. And I'm gonna have one more question. I can open it up for anybody who has questions. But a lot of autistic people do mask their autism. They for because they don't think it's acceptable in society, sadly. So what can you suggest for like let's focus on the school situation for teachers to create a safer environment that could reduce the meltdown frequencies? What type of things can teachers do?
Well, it's difficult because there's so many things about the sensory environment in a school that are not under our control. Um, I remember when I was in school, I was constantly either too hot or too cold. The seats were too hard. There was too much noise. There were too many people, too many behavioral expectations. Like there was all of this stuff coming at my sensory processing, especially in junior high, because in junior high, your your hormones are changing, your body's changing, and that puts an even bigger load. And so you don't have as much bandwidth to be able to cope with those things that are too hot, too cold, too loud, too noisy, too much. And then you're also trying to learn in that same environment. I mean, honestly, I feel like sometimes we ought to just like take a break when kids are going through puberty and be like, we'll come back to this later. Because I mean, are they learning anything? I'm not entirely certain that they are. I worked in junior highs for a long time, and yeah, I'm not sure that we learned anything except for just how to survive. But One of the things mentioned earlier, Ruth mentioned social stories. That can sometimes be useful. If you know a specific child, you can try to avoid triggers that they have. You can create a classroom environment that is hopefully a bit more tailored, but the problem is that each autistic person's different, and what bothers one person may be the thing that helps the other person. And that's where it gets tricky. I think one of the most helpful things, and this isn't always an option, but one of the most helpful things is giving people as much freedom as possible, because you can't conceivably accommodate for every single person all the time in the same environment, because we're all so different. But the more freedom that you can give people for flexibility, the more successful they're likely to be. A lot of kids that are autistic and go to college, the ones that go to college usually do better in college because it's a more flexible environment. They have more control over their own sensory environment and how they choose to do things. I remember I loved college. That was my favorite, because I would take my breakfast with me, like a bag of Cheerios and a cup of milk, and I would wear my pajamas to class and sit there in my comfort in my PJs with my cereal that I liked and sit there and learn. And I learned really well there. But when I was growing up in school, I went to a private school. We had a very strict dress code, which I did not find comfortable. They outlawed everything that I thought was comfortable. They also had a very strict schedule. You had to eat when they said you had to eat. Having a stricter environment, a stricter schedule, made it more difficult for me to meet the sensory needs that I have.
Very good. If anybody has any questions, please raise your hand, and we'll address them to Amy. It's a fascinating conversation. I find more important. It's important, obviously, for the autistic person to understand meltdowns, but more important for the non-autistic person to understand meltdowns. And if anybody has a question, please raise your hand.
The other thing is that people who aren't autistic can also have meltdowns.
True.
They are not as common, but they happen. And recognizing that, I think, is sometimes helpful.
Okay, there's a comment here in the chat.
Yeah, in their classroom, I would let my student walk around. It's okay to eat in my class. They would get short breaks. Yeah, the more flexibility you can infuse into a classroom, the more successful your autistic students are going to be, although some of them do appreciate consistency as well, which is where it gets difficult, because some people really need the consistency and some people really need the flexibility, and trying to manage that in the same classroom can be hard.
Mona has her hand up.
Hi. I have a group of students who all have different disabilities, many different disabilities. But I have one student who has a lot of behaviors, like he'll go like this, or he'll pinch his face, or he'll even hit himself, and that's fine. And I think it's fine that he does these behaviors, but the other students become very agitated by it. What can I tell those other students? How can I let them know that this is okay? These are just behaviors and he's not there to harm you or do anything wrong.
Okay, one difference, there are happy stems and there's unhappy stems. And I don't think that's something that's recognized enough. Sometimes when someone's stimming, it's because they are happy. They're very comfortable. And like some people, when they flap their arms like that, then that means they're very happy. And then other people, it's a sign that they are in distress. And so, one, be aware of that. If it's a happy stem, then you can say, this child does this behavior because they're happy. Like, this is their way of saying, I'm happy. But It could also be that it's an unhappy stem and they say, you know, this is their way of telling us that they're not feeling good inside and we need to give them space so that they can work to feel better. What are some things that make you feel better when you're upset, and trying to get them thinking about how they feel when they're upset or when they're really happy, and what are things they do and how that can look different for different people. That's kind of the conversation I would have with kids.
Excellent,
Yeah.
excellent. Thank you very much. That will be very helpful.
Good.
I worked in an agency where I had an individual who pulled his hair out. And that was a problem because he was pulling his hair out of his head. And basically,
Yeah.
that was not a STEM behavior. I think that was something else going on there.
And sometimes you have to try and replace the stem with another stem because some stems are dangerous. Like
Yeah.
if you're going to hit your head repeatedly,
Yeah.
that can be dangerous.
Yeah.
And so we do have to find ways of replacing different stems. Ideally, if it's an unhappy stem where we're hurting ourselves, we want to figure out what's causing the stem to begin with. Because
Yeah.
sometimes you have someone who's got a stem that's caused because maybe they feel sick inside and no one knows it because they haven't said it.
Yeah.
And it looks different from another person. So trying to
Yeah.
really pay attention and be the detective and try to listen with our eyes and our ears.
Okay, I'm going to get to Mark in 1 second, but we have a question here from in the chat from Angie, and the question is, what are the basic diagnostic criteria for autism? It's quite rare.
There's two that I'm aware of. There's the DSM-5, and then there's the let's see, I think we call it the IC-10. I think I use the DSM-5 because I'm in the United States. The major, I'm not going to go through the specific criteria, but the major criteria is that there's usually a difference in communication and sensory processing that has caused a particular level of disruption in development. So, and honestly, if you think about autism, I think the easiest way to describe it is that autism is nothing more than disruption in development that happened at an early enough stage that it disrupted or language and communication and sensory processing. And we have no other known reason of why the person would be having that kind of disruption. That's how I think about it. And I think it's the easiest way to think about it because we really don't understand what causes autism entirely. We know that some genetic differences can cause autism. We know that we can see different kinds of health conditions that are more common among autistics. But at its root, it's where that disruption happens at a very early stage, and because of that impacts communication and sensory processing.
Mark?
Just a couple of questions. One, do you think it can be hereditary? And the other, is it similar, the episodes to, I've seen people with bipolar and I've seen people who are epileptic having meltdowns. Is there kind of a similarity or crossover in any way?
Yeah. So one, I think that we're pretty certain that autism is at least somewhat genetic. Maybe not exactly like heritable generation to generation, but there's definitely a genetic component. We do know for sure that in cases of Ehlers-Danlos, which is what I have, you are 640% more likely to be autistic. So and that's genetic. So there's definitely some genetic components, some that are somewhat heritable. Bipolar, there is a lot of overlap. And there's also a lot of autistic women that end up diagnosed with bipolar instead of autism when they actually are autistic. So there's definitely an overlap there. And It's difficult because there's not as much consensus on, like, we have our diagnostic criteria, but there's also some room for interpretation there. And one of the things I like to think about when it comes to bipolar and kids, and epilepsy too, is I like to think of it in terms, when I'm looking at a kid, I go, okay, how much of this is development? What can we do to support development? And also, what can we do to support what can we do to support health and development? If we can support health and development, and then we still haven't accounted for something, then I start looking into more of a mental health diagnosis. Whereas I'd put autism in more of a developmental category. So I start with, all right, how much of what we're seeing is physiological? You know, is the kid sick? Have they got some kind of physiological condition that's been missed, that's making them feel bad, that is changing their behavior? Then, you know, is there disruption in their development that is changing their behavior? And then once we've accounted for all of those things, then at that point, that's when I usually start going, okay, can we look at something more mental health related, since we've ruled everything else out? Because a lot of mental health diagnoses are rule out diagnoses. With epilepsy, you could think of epilepsy as being kind of like a meltdown in the extreme, because you definitely are not in control at that point. You can definitely be set off by certain, like, sensory inputs. Like, some are set off by like strobe lighting or certain kinds of quick changes in lighting. So I would say that epilepsy is honestly a really good example of what a meltdown is, only in the extreme. So, because then you're just like completely shut off from that prefrontal cortex, and there's definitely a better understood physiological response happening in the body than what we see with autism and meltdowns. And bipolar, you also have a misdiagnosis rate as well. The mental health diagnoses can be challenging and frustrating in some ways. I like to describe psychology as we use our heart and our hands and we hop too. And so we're basically doing the best we can with what information we have to try to make people's lives better. And that doesn't mean that we know exactly what we're doing. We do the best we can, but there are limits. So
we have and there is a club dedicated to bipolar. It's in England, and that's their whole thing. That's the cause that they work on. And what is I got a question. I have a question here from Jacqueline, and it's what is the role of relaxation techniques, specifically that the incidence rate is about 1%?
Okay. I'm not sure what you mean by the incident rate is about 1%. I'm not sure what you're referencing.
Jacqueline?
Yeah. I just hello, thank you for your inspiring lecture. But as a physician, I know that the new cases in the whole world is about 1%. One case of autism every 100 people. So I think that it's not a rare syndrome or a rare disease. It's very common. So I return back to read about the relaxation techniques and the effectiveness of it in controlling the cases. And I want your practical experience about this.
Yeah. Okay. So autism is a relatively new diagnosis. I mean, autism itself, it was originally called Asperger's, and it wasn't even spoken about until World War II. So this is all relatively new. And yeah, it does vary depending on where you are in the world. I think it's honestly a lot more common than a lot of people think, because for a long time there, we thought that it was a diagnosis of boys. And a lot of our girls were getting missed because turns out boys and girls don't always look exactly the same. So I think that definitely is a challenge, because it's difficult. It's difficult to catch sometimes, especially since you have a range of kids' abilities to mask. A lot of the girls get missed because they are able to mask better. And think about it this way: the more intelligence you have, usually the more bandwidth you have to be able to hide things than other people. Also, if you've grown up as a female in a society, a lot of times you spend a lot of your early years focused on social interactions with other people, or at least that's how it works in the United States most of the time. And so you're going to be in a better position to hide behaviors that would be more telling. I get a lot of girls coming to me, honestly, because girls get missed so much. I do think, though, that like relaxation techniques are so incredibly helpful. I'm a huge fan of meditation. That was a game changer for me, because there's so much coming at you sensory wise. It's a lot. And to be able to focus your mind so that you can listen to what's inside instead of all of the noise that is outside can be really helpful in keeping you from getting completely overwhelmed by all of the sensory inputs coming at you. There's a lot of different approaches. Breathing exercises can be a really good one, because one, everybody breathes, but two, how we breathe influences how our autonomic nervous system is working. Like we can actually kind of influence our autonomic nervous system that way, and then also our autonomic nervous system can influence us in that way. But one of the things we like to do with children, we'll call it a 5 breath. So we'll breathe in and breathe out and breathe in and out and go all the way that way to the end of the hand. And it's easy because most of us have at least one hand that we can use, and it's always with you. It's not like we detach it and leave it behind. Another one I like to do with children, my favorite, is we call it bee breath. And you put your fingers in your ears, and I always flap my arms because they're the little like bee wings, and then they go and when you hum and your fingers are in your ears, it sounds like a bunch of bees are in your ears. And it kind of blocks out some of the sensory input, especially like noise and stuff. But it's also getting people to regulate their breathing, and regulating your breathing helps with the vagus nerve and the autonomic nervous system. And a lot of us that are autistic, I know I mentioned earlier, I have hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And my mom has it, my kids have it, my grandmother has it. They haven't quite found like they found one of the genes, but it's a little bit more complex than some of the other types of Ehlers-Danlos. But if you have it, 640% of us are more likely to be autistic. And I think that a lot of times we don't recognize that there are a lot of times physiological things inside our bodies that aren't working as well. We don't understand it, but they just don't function quite as well. And because of that, we don't feel as well. Our autonomic nervous system doesn't work as well. And I mean, if that's not working as well, then you can see that you're definitely going to have some problems when it comes to sensory regulation and being able to relax and being able to regulate that autonomic nervous system, which I think is really kind of what it all comes down to, is trying to support physiological health. We think about autism as being mental health, but let's be honest, I think that mental health a lot of times is physiological health that we just don't understand well yet. So a lot of the things that we use to help with physiological health do help with autism and meltdowns as well.
Mark?
Yeah. Starting to be a lot of people late on in life are starting to find who have been diagnosed as, say, dyslexic, and they're now getting diagnosed as being usually mild autistic. And we're now starting to use the word neurodiverse or neurodiversity or neurodivergent. So do you find then people who are autistic, there can quite often be a crossover of some other things like dyslexia or dysgraphia, dyscalculia, ADHD, etc.?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And the thing is that if your development has gone awry early in life to the point that it's impacted communication and sensory processing, it's probably affected a lot of other things too. So most of the time, if you see an autistic child, they aren't just autistic. They have dyslexia or dysgraphia or hyperlexia or dyscalculia, or they have any number of processing differences because their brain has not wired up in the way that we expect. And because it hasn't wired up in the way we expect, then they're taking different pathways to do different things. And it'd be nice in some ways if we could wire things up correctly the first time, because things are more efficient that way, right? But on the other hand, if we did, then there wouldn't be quite as much diverse ways of thinking in the world. And we definitely would not come up with some of the creative solutions that we've come up with to whether that's reading, math, writing, any kind of learning. So pluses and minuses, but you definitely see a lot of overlap. You also see a much higher rate of certain health conditions among autistic people. And a lot of times people aren't aware of that. Especially autistic women have a high rate of autoimmune conditions. I also said there was a high rate of connective tissue diseases. There's quite a few of those kinds of situations, and that's something that we really haven't got a handle on quite yet. But I think that it could be a real game changer, because when people feel good inside, they do better.
So, Mark?
I'll ask you a question. At whatever age you are, it's twofold. If somebody developed a tablet and you could take a tablet today and you would be totally cured of being autistic. And I'll ask the question as another one. If you were, say, 10-year-old, 8-year-old, and you had the option of taking a tablet and you would then be totally cured. I know that's not possible, and that's just a total hypothetical thing.
Yeah. Would I do it? So here's how I'm going to think about it. I would not change where I've been. But if I could have a positive impact on my health, let's say we address some of this connective tissue problems I have and I feel better, and so maybe it would have not happened if we'd been able to fix it the first time, I would love to fix that part. But I don't want to go back and undo my life experiences either, because they've made me who I am. So if I can get rid of the health stuff that I think has contributed to the neurodivergence, that'd be awesome. But I still would like to keep my life experiences, because I think it's really contributed to the person that I've become. I'm a much more compassionate person, I think, than I would have been because of my experiences. And it's allowed me to be able to give a lot of parents insights into their children that I could not have done without having had those experiences. So there's a lot of good things that have come with it. But at the same time, I also recognize some of those good things are because I have more bandwidth than others. But also, I think that a lot of times when kids don't have bandwidth, sometimes it's because they have some kind of physiological need that we haven't identified yet. And if we can find ways of supporting kids so that they can feel better, I think that should always be a yes, because we want everyone to be able to feel as good in their bodies as they possibly can. That doesn't undo development that's happened prior to, but we can make a heck of a lot of a difference moving forward if we're able to support people so that they feel good inside. And that is 100% worth it every time. So
I think that's a good final statement for this session. I much appreciate you all being here today and being open to the idea of learning more from Amy on this whole thing. The better understanding we all have, the more empathetic we can be, the more supportive we can be, the more we can make this a better world, a kinder world, be more humanitarian world, which is important, I think. So I appreciate you all being here.